to women and saying, guard it carefully. So before I begin fleshing out Gilder's thesis, there's three things I want to tell you. First, you may wonder why focus on Gilder. It's just one book. It was written in the 80s. Who cares? It actually isn't one book. I found it to be the most intriguing read of recent research reviews I've done at the Institute of Marriage and Family Canada. But there are other sources that confirm this point of view. I would say Margaret Mead does from her studies in anthropology. I would add David Blankenhorn does in his book The Future of Marriage, which is a very recent addition to the literature. So that's why I chose to focus on Men and Marriage, the one book. Second thing is, I have to say, I was really brought up to not discuss sex and sexuality in a public place or even really one-on-one with friends. Unfortunately, my enthusiasm for the book kind of blinded me to the obvious problem that I would essentially end up talking about sex in front of a large audience. So I apologize, and I'm going to do the best I can. And the third and final thing that I would add at this point is that I'm going to quote, especially in this middle section, quite heavily from George Gilder. And I'm not always going to say quote, end quote, because it just is kind of disturbing to the flow, but neither am I plagiarizing from him. So if you're very, very keenly interested, please ask me and I will give you the talk. And there will be the quotation marks and sources and references in there. So here we go. What does Gilder say? What is George Gilder's thesis? It is that the, quote, sexual superiority of women over men is the main fact of life, and that the crucial process of civilization is the subordination of male sexual impulses and male biology to the long-term horizons of female sexuality. In one way or another, he says, men born sexually inferior and more likely to doubt their own sexuality must be made equal to women by society. He does quote heavily from Margaret Mead, who says, the worry that boys will not grow up to be men is much more widespread than the worry that girls will not grow up to be women. And she is also quoted as saying that no culture across the globe worries about what to do with their women. They all worry about how to nurture their boys to become men. A woman's sexual superiority lies in the fact that her sexual functions are much more encompassing than a man's over the course of her life, whether or not she has children. Even childless women are reminded monthly that they could. And he goes on to highlight that sexual love, intercourse, marriage, the conception of a child, breastfeeding, these are all things that demonstrate the sexual primacy of women. Men, on the other hand, he says, have but one sexual organ. As a physical reality, the male sexual repertoire is very limited. Men have only one sex organ and one sex act. Everything else, he says, is guided by culture and imagination. Other male roles and other styles of masculine identity must be learned or created. He goes on to say that the very most important roles of husband and father in a durable marriage are a cultural invention, necessary to civilized life, but ultimately fragile. As so many sexual liberals are very keen to point out and even encourage, Gilder acknowledges that the male sexual role is quite trivial and nowadays can be entirely foregone. We all know that you can have children without the presence of a husband in your life. There's really no need for a father to be anywhere around when a baby is born. No matter how equally the functions of child rearing are shared, Gilder says the man will always know that the woman's role with the children was more important and more organically indispensable. So in this way, he's arguing that a woman's sexuality unfolds in an unbroken line and that it's something that women actually take for granted, that we question our sexuality less often, which is more difficult for a man. This is where we get into the female role in civilization. The female responsibility for civilization, he writes, cannot be granted or assigned to men. Unlike a woman, a man has no civilized role or agenda inscribed in his body. Although his relationship to specific children can give him a sense of the future resembling the woman's, it always comes through the woman and her choices. He goes on to say that women must teach men, that women must manipulate male sexual desire in order to teach men the long-term cycles of female sexuality and biology on which civilization is based. And this is interesting, I feel, and quite alarming, because anyone with even a cursory knowledge of our public school curriculum on sex education today will know that we are currently teaching women quite the opposite insofar as I believe we're teaching the short-term sexual impulses of men, which is quite the opposite of what he is proposing that we do. In Making Boys into Men, Gilder stresses how important marriage is. Without a durable relationship with a woman, a man's sexual life is a series of brief and temporary exchanges impelled by a desire to affirm his most rudimentary masculinity. But with love, sex becomes refined by selectivity, and other dimensions of personality are engaged and developed. The man himself is refined, and his sexuality becomes not a mere impulse, but a commitment in society, possibly to be fulfilled in the birth of specific children who are legally and recognizably his. His sex life can then be conceived and experienced as having specific long-term importance like a woman's. And the most enduring way to make this commitment, Gilder suggests, is through marriage. The most enduring way to make a commitment like this is through marriage. So we'll recall how marriage is on decline in Canada today at this time. Men are law-abiding and productive in essence because they discover this is the way that they can win the love of a woman. The outcome is set by women and work, Gilder says. If a man finds that work that affirms his manhood and a girl who demands that his sexuality succumb to hers, he is likely to become a valuable and constructive citizen. If, on the other hand, he sees long-term work and marriage as a woman's world, he will tend to exploit both jobs and women as a short-term way to money and pleasure. He goes on further to say that the real contribution made by individual men in their work rarely exceeds the real damage they can do if their masculinity is not socialized or subjected to female patterns. So there are, following this thesis, really broad economic implications to the thesis. In most of the world's societies, sexual relations follow achievement of manhood or accompany it. Men have to work hard to establish a household such that a marriage in a bygone era, certainly not today, such that a marriage or sex could occur. So Gilder credits marriage and social stigma around sex partly for the Industrial Revolution in England. Says couples could not get married until they were economically independent with a separate household. Thus, sexual energies were directly tied to economic growth, and since strong sanctions were imposed on premarital sex, population growth was directly linked to economic productivity. So that's the thrust of Gilder's thesis. To summarize it, he presents the idea that women are superior, starting with our sexuality, which we encounter in many more ways than men do on a daily basis. He also presents the idea that marriage helps socialize the mass of males, making them into productive, contributing citizens. And finally, he presents the idea that the failure to acknowledge this has consequences on our social and economic fabric. So what might those consequences be? Well, I tried to think through some of those things and see if you agree or not. 6 consequences jump to my mind, so I'll outline those here. One is the changing male-female dynamics in relationship and the total and complete lack of norms. It is almost impossible, and religious people are not exempt by a long shot, to be unaffected by the lack of norms in relationships and a new sexual aggression found in dating today. It seems pretty clear to me that instead of men rising up to the long-term horizons of women, that women have fallen to the short-term expectations of men. And this is a generalization, of course, to a degree. We all know men who have long-term expectations. But on the societal level and the way our culture is going, I think it's fair to make the distinction. And the results of failed relationships and the difficulties associated with that can be seen in a number of different types of insecurities, relational or otherwise, abortions and divorce, etc., problems for men and women alike. It's become a lot more difficult for a young person today to figure out how to achieve something that most young people do want, and that's marriage and family. A second outcome I identified was the demise of marriage, and I mean this both in the sense that existing marriages are breaking up with a greater frequency, but also from the standpoint that we are not getting married as much in the first place. So we've really given up on marriage as an institution.